All right, here we have part 3 of the road to Civil War. So, there is a fort. Fort Sumner, okay? It's a small Union garrison of fewer than 100 soldiers and officers. They're holding this fort. It's a vulnerable target for the Confederacy. Now, there are people pressuring Jefferson Davis to take Fort Sumner and thereby demonstrate the Confederate government's resolve. Some hoped that the Confederacy would gain foreign recognition, especially from Great Britain, by taking the fort. The situation grows dire, as local merchants refuse to sell food to the fort's Union soldiers, and by mid-April, the garrison supplies begin to run out. So President Lincoln let it be known to the Confederate leaders that he planned to resupply the Union forces. His strategy is clear. The decision to start the war would rest squarely on the Confederates and not on the Union. On April the 12th, 1861, Confederate forces in Charleston began a bombardment of Fort Sumner. Now, what had happened is that on April the 4th, Lincoln had ordered unarmed ships to take food and supplies to the 69 soldiers. Jefferson Davis was equally determined to stop any effort to supply the fort. Now, his secretary for the Confederacy, Richard Lathers, warned Davis that if the South fired first, there would be no compromise. If war is forced upon the North, there would be no compromise. So, Davis ignores the warnings. Now, on April 11th, Confederate General Pierce G.T. Brugard, who had studied under Robert Anderson, the Union general at West Point, urged his former professor to surrender to him and sent him a case of whiskey and a box of cigars to help convince him. Anderson refused the gifts and the request. So at 4:30 in the morning on April the 12th, Confederate cannons began firing on Fort Sumner. The bright flashes filled the sky. Booms awakened the city. Thousands rushed out to watch. Finally, the outgunned Anderson, his ammunition and food gone, lowered the stars and stripes, and the attack on Fort Sumner is over. And then the New York Democratic Congressman Daniel Sickles writes Lincoln's Secretary of War and says, "We are at war with a foreign power. A civil war of unimaginable horrors has begun." So, the attack on Fort Sumner meant war had come. And on April 15, 1861, Lincoln calls upon local states to begin supplying armed forces to defeat the rebellion and regain Fort Sumner. Faced with a need to choose between the Confederacy and the Union, border states and those of the Upper South, which had earlier been reluctant to dissolve their ties, were inspired to take action. They quickly began voting for secession. The convention in Virginia, which had been assembled earlier, considered the question of secession, voted to join the Confederacy. Arkansas left the Union on May the 6th, along with Tennessee only one day later. North Carolina follows on May the 20th. Not all of the residents of the border states in the Upper South wished to join the Confederacy, however. There are pro-Union feelings that remain strong in Tennessee, especially in the eastern part of the state where the slaves were few. Now, the state of Virginia, home of the Revolutionary leader and presidents such as George Washington, Thomas Jefferson, James Madison, and James Monroe, literally was split on the issue of secession. Residents in the north and west of the state, where few slaveholders resided, rejected secession. So these counties subsequently united to form what is today West Virginia, which enters the Union as a free state in 1863. The rest of Virginia, including the historic lands along the Chesapeake Bay, joins the Confederacy. The addition of this area gave the Confederacy even greater hope and brought Robert E. Lee arguably the best military commander of the day, to their side. In addition, the secession of Virginia brought Washington, D.C. very close to the Confederacy, and fears that the border state of Maryland would also join the Confederacy, thus trapping the U.S. Capitol within Confederate territories, constantly plagued Lincoln.